Hello, Malcolm Brady here of Dublin City University. I'm going to talk to you today about the governance of an organisation and the responsibility to society of that organisation. So they're the two topic areas for today. So that'll take in shareholders, stakeholders, and corporate social responsibility. Um, this is very much part of the execution phase of our PACE framework, purpose, analysis, choice, execution. So we're very much in the execution stage and linked with monitoring and control of strategy. So for starting point here, really just a number of books out in the last number of decades about the corporation, not all very positive towards the corporations. They're often very critical of organizations and corporations. So we'll take that as a starting point that many people out there are critical of organizations and what they do and how they're governed and controlled. So let's look at governance for a moment. This is the typical governance structure of an organization. Management or the executives of the organization are the day-to-day people, the people who run the organization on a day-to-day basis. And they're, let's call it, supervised or monitored by a board of directors. And the board of directors are acting on behalf of the shareholders as a whole. So this model is assuming the shareholder, is taking the shareholders as the owners of the organization, and they are controlling the organization and ensuring that it's run in their best interests. And the theory that underpins this particular model is principal agent theory or agency theory, and with two elements, principal and agent. And you can see here there's actually two cases of principal and agent involved. If you regard the shareholders as the principals, the agents, their agents are the board of directors who are appointed to act on their behalf. And then management are agents, or executives are agents, and they're reporting to or carrying out what the board of directors as the principal directs them to do. So there's two agency relationships here. And some quick pointers about agency theory. The Bourgeois and Brodwin article talks about some of the key elements of agency theory, and three of them here are mentioned as information asymmetry. And this is usually the case that the agent usually has more, well, there's usually a difference of information available to the agents and to the board of directors. Usually the agent has more information because they're involved in the day-to-day running of the organization. The board of directors are part-time or not fully involved, only involved at particular moments. So they don't have full information. So there's this gap in information or information asymmetry between those two elements of the principal-agent relationship. Usually that requires some kind of monitoring either of outcome, in other words, what's produced, or effort, what's put in. So either inputs or outputs, or possibly both, are being monitored. And that's a way of reducing the asymmetry of information and ensuring the agent carries out the wishes of the principal. But there is an issue of moral hazard on the part of the agent, on the basis that the agent can do things that are not in the best interest of the principal, that are in the agent's own best interest. So there's that issue of moral hazard always in the principal-agent relationship. And much of the literature looks at how to minimize that moral hazard. In terms of the agent, we have couple of principles here. Transparency, in other words, that agent the actions of the agent should be as transparent as possible to the principal, so the principal can see what's happening and be sure of what's happening. And the principal can align incentives to ensure that the agent acts in the principal's best interests, and this also helps avoiding moral hazard. So, for example, stock or stock options, they're related to the performance of the organization as a whole. So if the agent is rewarded in line with the performance of the organization as a whole, that should align the interests of the agent with the interests of the principal. That's the idea behind stock options. In terms of management themselves, or the agent themselves, so I just shift this back. Well, these are some of the potential moral hazards: managerial mischief, or managers doing things, taking actions that are in their own best interests, maximizing revenue rather than maximizing profit, for example, or avoiding risk, or indeed seeking risk beyond the risk level that the principal would like to assume. Shirking, obviously, there was not putting full effort in. Opportunism, carrying out, again, actions that are in the interest of the agent are taking advantage of the principal's lack of knowledge or lack of transparency in the relationship, or the consumption of perquisites, which is Jensen and Meckling's major point, that agents will do things to suit themselves, award themselves bigger cars or bigger offices or more secretaries or dinners out or whatever it is, perquisites that enhance the agent, but not necessarily, but maybe at the expense of the principal. So some of the people who've written on this, I've mentioned Jensen and Meckling already, and the big sanction here for management is the market for corporate control. In other words, they argue that if management consume too many perquisites and so on and reduce the profitability of the firm, it'll become a target for takeover. And if it becomes a target for takeover, if it's taken over, usually management are pushed out by the new owners, the new board of directors, and a new management put in place. So management will lose their jobs, whatever. So that's one sanction that's out there that they identify, the market for corporate control. Fama again, sorry, Jensen and Fama, Jensen again, in another paper, look at this separation of ownership and control, look at this issue again. And they identify the shareholders as the residual risk bearers. In other words, they get whatever's left after other stakeholders have been cared for, suppliers, customers, employees, and so on. The shareholders get the residual. And they determine a decision control process here, this governing process, whereby management tend to initiate new ideas. They then go to boards of directors who ratify them to make sure they're in line with the mission of the organization, with the shareholder interests and so on. And they give permission to some of these projects to be initiated. These then are implemented. So management are responsible for implementing the projects, and in turn they're monitored by the board of directors to ensure that they're carried out in the way they were intended, and again that the results are in line with shareholder interests. So this is the kind of decision-making or governance and control model of Jensen, Meckling, and Fama and Jensen. And it's been hugely significant. However, not everybody agrees with shareholder value and this concept of maximizing shareholder value. So we have two very contrasting views of the firm. This one exemplified by Milton Friedman's famous quote in his paper to the New York Times: there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. So essentially, the only activity of business is to, the activities are designed to increase the profits of the business, which are in turn increasing shareholder value. And that's the purpose of a business. And they shouldn't be involved in other things. He says getting involved in social responsibility projects and things like that are actually the government's job, not the organization's job. Its job is to produce profits which are taxed, and that tax money goes to the government, who then distribute that in whatever way society deems best or government deems best. However, not everybody agrees. This is Bartlett and Gashal. This minimalist, passive, and self-serving definition, that is profit maximization, grossly understates reality. Corporations are one of the most, if not the most important institutions of modern society. A company today is much more than just a business, and they define what some of the other things that companies are besides simply a business. There are repositories of knowledge, repositories of resources. They share a huge responsibility for generating the wealth of the country. They have responsibility for defining, creating, and distributing value among suppliers, customers, and so on, and the state via taxation. And it makes corporations one of society's principal agents of social change. Companies are important forums for social interaction, obviously within the firm. In other words, when we work, our jobs are a big part of our lives. And for personal fulfillment, again, jobs are a big part of our lives. And indeed, in the new economy, in the new platform type businesses, the firms provide forums for social interaction in general, not just for the people who work within the organization. So they say really that to just simply view organizations as vehicles for profit maximization is far, far too simplistic. They're much more than that, and we have to regard them as such and hold them to that. Carol and Shabana identify 4 areas where the firm has additional responsibilities besides the economic one. So the economic is the first one, that goes without saying. However, they have legal responsibilities, ethical, and what they call discretionary or philanthropic type responsibilities to society. And all of these are important. It's not just simply profit maximization. So there's been a big move against profit maximization and shareholder value maximization to take on a stakeholder view of the company, of the organization, not simply a shareholder view. And indeed, this was taken up by the Business Roundtable in the US in 2019, and this made a major change away from shareholder primacy towards or including a commitment to all the stakeholders of the firm. So this was 200 chief executives of major firms in the US, Apple, Pepsi, Walmart, for example, and they broke with decades of a long-held corporate orthodoxy, that is the maximization of shareholder value, and issued a new statement on the purpose of the corporation. And this is that companies should no longer advance only the interests of shareholders. The group said they must invest also in their employees. They must protect the environment and deal fairly and ethically with suppliers. So they've widened it to 3 new stakeholders: employees, society in general via the environment, and suppliers. Interesting, no mention of customers here, but perhaps that was later on in the statement, but it would be surprising if they didn't include customers as part of the stakeholders of a firm. However, again, not everybody is in line with this. We've had some already, and if you read this article by Mankey, Gregory Mankey, who's not against the idea, but it just says really that CEOs are not the best people to deal with these multiple responsibilities, that he essentially says it still should be up to public servants to look after the other entities and let CEOs look after shareholder interests or maximizing shareholder value. This is Salter in a recent Harvard Business School working paper, again comes to the same point. And he's bringing it a little bit further, actually. He's really saying that firms should go back to the original reason for the instituting of limited companies. And this is to carry out projects that were too large or too risky for single individuals to take on, and groups of individuals had to take them on. And because the projects were large and risky, liability was limited to the shares involved in the firm and not beyond that. So he advises corporations, provided they pay the reserve price to the various parties, customers, suppliers, and shareholders, they should refocus on what is and always has been the real purpose of business: satisfying the needs and solving problems of society at large in a profitable manner. So he's advocating going back to that original. In fact, it's the original ideal of firms. 2019 Harvard Business School working paper. So finally, we come to a formal technique for looking at stakeholders, and this is the power interest matrix. And again, this is just a technique for you to consider, by which you can consider the various stakeholders and what level of power they have over the firm or organization, what level of interest they have in the organization, in which they can have quite a deal of power, but relatively little interest in the organization. Sometimes some stakeholders may have that. They might only need to be if they have high power and low interest, they need to be kept satisfied. So they're important. You need to keep them satisfied, but you don't need to do anything more than that. However, if they have high power and high interest, they're key players. You need to look after them well. And if they have a high interest but relatively low power, which is often the case with society at large, they must be kept informed. And then They also suggest identifying facilitators and blockers. Some stakeholders will be facilitators to your interests, so you need to identify those, and they can support your strategic initiatives. Blockers may impede the strategic initiatives, so you need to be aware of what stakeholders there are and what way they might act. And then just I'm going to finish an example in the tech sector. This is a quote from Knowledge and Wharton. Professor Werbach of Wharton Business School, Professor of Business Ethics, and he's basically saying that the idealism with which the tech sector announced its original arrival is gone, and it's been gone for several years. It was a good thing, and it changed, built world-changing businesses, but time now to realize that good people can do bad things. So there's been a change in the tech sector. And I'm going to end with this one here from Mark Zuckerberg, his open letter to the Washington Post, again in 2019. And essentially, he's calling on the need for new rules to govern the internet and associated businesses. So he's talking about a more active role for governments and regulators. So again, they're a stakeholder and indeed a monitor and controller. So they're the principal, and you could argue a principal as well. Excuse me. And he's talking about updating the rules and preserving it for what it's best for freedom of people, for people to express themselves, and for entrepreneurs, and protecting society. So people, society, entrepreneurs, he's identified three of the stakeholders there. And then he's talking about putting in place an independent body and a common global framework. And some principles, he's identified one particular principle, data portability, which he's put forward. Now, we have learned that one of the strategic approaches is follows the lines of institutional theory, which says essentially it's the rules of the game define very much the what businesses can do, and if you can control the rules of the game, you can enhance your own business. So there's an argument that Mark Zuckerberg here is attempting to set the rules of the game, which may be in his own best interest as well, but ideally they could be in the best interest of society also. What happens here we don't know what's going to happen here yet, but clearly there's work taking place, and work yet to do. Okay, thank you for listening.